Suppressing Consciousness, Mechanisms of General Anesthesia, a review article by Anthony Hudetz. This article will serve as a history of recent work that has attempted to localize consciousness in the brain through the use of anesthetics. This quote gives a good summary of the state of current research in the field of consciousness theory. Hudetz writes, "Although several theories have been proposed, current evidence suggests that the failure of conscious perception at a critical depth of anesthesia may best be interpreted as information received but not perceived." Before we attempt to localize consciousness, it is helpful to generate a definition of what is meant by the term. William James defined it as an awareness of oneself and one's environment, or that which is necessary for the perceiving, thinking, and willfully acting I. However, consciousness does not simply mean wakefulness. For example, sleepwalkers' actions produce EEG patterns that are characteristic of awake people, but most sleepwalkers do not seem to be conscious of their actions, nor do they have any memory of what took place. Further, patients under anesthesia are not normally considered to be awake, but they might still retain some aspects of the brain functions that contribute to the overall experience of consciousness. Research using anesthesia to study levels of consciousness has shown that subconscious information can influence conscious decisions. This implies that cortical involvement alone is not a marker of consciousness. Because we are only aware of, or conscious of, a small fraction of the information that is passing through our brains at any particular time, the presence of activity in some cortical areas isn't enough to declare that a person is conscious. Activity in cortical regions could be information that is being processed below the level of consciousness. This information is presented to illustrate the challenges with describing, quantifying, and measuring consciousness in a scientific way. As anesthesia is administered, amnesia occurs before the patient is actually rendered unconscious. Therefore, it is possible for a patient to have no recall of an event, but to still have been conscious of it at the time. Surgical stimulation can activate the brain to produce brief periods of awareness without leaving the patient with any recollection of the event. This awareness is thought to last for no more than 200 milliseconds. However, evidence suggests that a minimum processing time of 200 to 500 milliseconds is required for elementary conscious sensory perception to develop, and the brief awareness that can occur from surgical stimulation does not last this long. Therefore, the experience can't be placed into context with other concurrent experiences. This raises the question, can someone be conscious of sensory information without having any memory of how the information fits into the recent past? The article says no. Short-term memory is necessary to piece together the fragments of sensory information into conscious experience. There are three main ways to abolish conscious sensation: suppress sensory stimuli peripherally, block sensory stimuli en route to the brain, or inhibit the brain from receiving or interpreting the stimuli. Since we're interested in the brain as the seat of consciousness, we will focus on sensory information suppression in brain areas. In anesthesia induced with isoflurane, for example, somatosensory signals are suppressed in the thalamus by disrupting action potentials and altering sodium and calcium channel activity. The thalamus is important because it is the site of initial processing for almost all incoming sensory information. As you can see in the diagram, it is full of connections to other brain areas, leading to its consideration as a potential seat of consciousness. Human fMRI studies support the idea that the thalamus is the preferential site of anesthetic action, but research has shown that the thalamus has a great deal of connections to the cortex, so it is impossible to tell whether thalamic activity suppression is a result of suppression of information going out to other brain areas or suppression of information being received from the cortex. The problem with the hypothesis that the thalamus acts as a consciousness on-off switch is that the brain still responds to sensory information even under anesthetics. For example, at isoflurane concentrations that suppress EEG activity, generally a sign of loss of consciousness, auditory and visual stimuli can still produce cortical activation. Additionally, studies have shown that patients under anesthesia can still process auditory information to form implicit memories, even though they have no explicit recall of the information. This suggests that the thalamus isn't an on-off switch that is totally shut down under anesthesia, because it can clearly still process sensory information. As a result of these studies, current research is looking into a cortical integrative hypothesis of unconsciousness rather than trying to isolate a specific brain region as the seat of consciousness. Recent research correlates unconsciousness to the ability of an individual to integrate information rather than just perceive it. A recent study administered sevoflurane to patients and found that it reduced the correlation of MRI signals between areas of the temporal lobe, suggesting that these areas experienced reduced connectivity. It seems that these areas were unable to respond in phase with each other and therefore could not communicate information. Recently, this sort of loss of cortical connectivity was also demonstrated in natural sleep, which of course is an example of a loss of consciousness, suggesting that this research might be on the right track. One particular neural network of interest is the frontoparietal network. Regions of the prefrontal and posterior parietal association cortices are components of the networks for attention and working memory. The prefrontal cortex has been shown to enhance relevant sensory input, possibly leading to integration and higher-level processing of simple sensory information from the thalamus. Also, since many studies have shown that attention is required for conscious sensory perception, this has been an important area of research into consciousness. It is hypothesized that the frontoparietal network plays a role in the contextual interpretation of sensory information through reciprocal connections throughout the cortex. In reciprocal connectivity, neurons extend to and from various brain regions, thereby sending data out to other areas as well as receiving incoming data and processing it. One theory is that forward connections analyze incoming data, while feedback projections from these neurons modulate and interpret the data that gets sent back to the original area, resulting in conscious awareness of that information. In one study, Lamy and colleagues anesthetized monkeys and found that they were unable to modulate and process information from complex visual stimuli, a task their awake counterparts could easily do. This suggests that information integration is one of the primary functions that is suspended during anesthesia and could account for the experience of unconsciousness. An interesting finding from these studies is that anesthetics don't affect information flow in each direction to the same degree. In one study, it was found that at anesthetic concentrations that produced unconsciousness, feedback from the frontal to the parietal and occipital cortices was inhibited more than the corresponding feed-forward information pathway. This suggests that the ability to modulate and interpret information is necessary for consciousness to be present. Anesthetics also alter gamma wave oscillations seen in EEGs, particularly around the 40 Hz frequency. This particular frequency is usually seen when people are engaged in conscious cognitive functions such as selective attention, short-term memory, behavioral arousal, and formation of perceptual representations. However, different anesthetic agents have different effects on gamma waves. It seems to be that the key to anesthetic-induced loss of consciousness lies in the desynchronization of gamma activity between brain areas. When gamma waves are disrupted, distant brain areas aren't able to communicate information with each other, resulting in a loss of processes that are normally associated with consciousness. Current tests of cortico-cortical connectivity are just functional. They don't reveal specific pathways that are blocked by anesthetics. Since researchers can't tell what pathways are being blocked, it is likely that different anesthetics affect different neural pathways in order to produce unconsciousness. It is therefore likely that there is more than one way to generate unconsciousness, and thus there is more than one brain area or pathway that is responsible for conscious experiences. This begs the question, do you think a consciousness pathway or brain area will ever be found? With mounting evidence suggesting that there are numerous ways to induce unconsciousness, it seems unlikely that the phenomenon of conscious experience can be isolated to a particular network of neurons. Perhaps it is more plausible to understand consciousness as an umbrella term that encompasses a great many varied functions, each of which requires activation of different brain areas. In this way, anesthetics can be understood as tools that block certain functions that are characteristic of consciousness, and these tools can act in a variety of different ways.